In the unforgiving wilderness of Montana Territory, 1882, where mercy was scarcer than gold and strangers meant trouble, Samuel Whitmore made a decision that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his own life. What started as a simple act of kindness to a desperate mother and her infant would unravel secrets buried deeper than any grave in the frontier, revealing a truth so shocking that it would force him to question his very identity and the peaceful existence he had built in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The storm had been building for 3 days, turning the dusty trails into rivers of mud and forcing even the hardiest travelers to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Samuel had been mending fence posts near his modest homestead when he first spotted the figure stumbling through the rain, barely visible through the sheets of water cascading from the darkening sky. At first glance, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as the figure drew closer, he realized it was a woman, her long dark hair plastered to her face, clutching something precious against her chest. Samuel dropped his tools and ran toward her, his boots splashing through the puddles that had formed in the worn pathway leading to his cabin. The woman collapsed just as he reached her, and he could see now that she was cradling a baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in a tattered blanket that had once been blue but was now stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. The infant was eerily quiet, its tiny face pale and still, and for a terrifying moment Samuel thought the child might already be dead. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Samuel called out, gently lifting the woman's chin to look into her eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent, filled with a fear so profound that it seemed to reach right into his soul. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper before her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness entirely. Without hesitation, Samuel scooped both mother and child into his arms, surprised by how light they both were, as if they were made of nothing more substantial than the morning mist that often rolled across the valley. He carried them into his cabin, kicking the door shut behind him against the howling wind, and laid them gently on his own bed, the only comfortable spot in his sparse but clean home. The cabin was simple but well-built, constructed from logs Samuel had cut himself from the surrounding forest. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark in the growing evening light. Shelves lined the walls, holding his few books, some tools, and the basic supplies necessary for frontier life. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, with a cast-iron stove that served for both cooking and heating. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was safe. Samuel quickly built up the fire, coaxing flames from the cold ashes with practiced efficiency. The warmth began to fill the small space, pushing back the chill that had settled into the wooden walls during the storm. He heated water in a large pot, then carefully began cleaning the mud and grime from the woman's face and hands, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the thin gold band on her left ring finger that caught the firelight. The baby stirred as Samuel gently unwrapped the blanket, revealing a perfect little girl with wisps of dark hair and skin that was gradually warming from its frightening pallor. She opened her eyes briefly, and Samuel was struck by their unusual color, a deep amber that seemed almost golden in the flickering light. The child looked at him with an intelligence that seemed far too mature for such a young face, then closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep. As the night wore on, Samuel kept vigil beside his unexpected guests, feeding small spoonfuls of warm broth to the woman whenever she seemed conscious enough to swallow, and checking on the baby to ensure she was breathing steadily. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney like some wild beast trying to claw its way inside. But within the cabin, there was peace, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the woman and child. It was near dawn when the woman finally opened her eyes fully, looking around the unfamiliar room with confusion before her gaze settled on Samuel, who had fallen asleep in his chair beside the bed. She sat up slowly, wincing as if every movement caused her pain, and reached immediately for her baby, relief flooding her features when she found the child sleeping peacefully beside her. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger now but still carrying traces of an accent that Samuel couldn't quite place. It wasn't the flat vowels of the eastern states, nor the rolling drawl of the deep south, but something else entirely, something that spoke of distant places and foreign shores. "You're safe," Samuel replied, stretching the stiffness from his neck as he stood up from his chair. "This is my homestead, about 20 miles north of Helena. You collapsed in the storm yesterday evening. I'm Samuel Whitmore." The woman studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Samuel was used to such scrutiny from strangers. Frontier life made everyone cautious, and a single woman with a baby had every reason to be especially wary of strange men. He was a tall man, lean from hard work and simple living, with brown hair that was beginning to show silver at the temples despite his 35 years. His eyes were kind but serious, the eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to know its dangers but had somehow managed to retain his compassion. "Thank you," she said finally, her hand resting protectively on her sleeping daughter. "I'm Sarah Morrison. This is my daughter, Emma." She paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "We were traveling to California when our wagon broke down. My husband went to get help, but that was 3 days ago, and when the storm came, I couldn't wait any longer." Samuel nodded, accepting her explanation without question, though something in her manner suggested there was more to the story than she was telling. On the frontier, people often carried secrets, running from pasts they preferred not to discuss. He had learned long ago not to pry into such matters unless they directly concerned his safety or that of his neighbors. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said. "The storm should pass by this afternoon, and then we can figure out what to do about finding your husband." But as Sarah Morrison settled into his home with her mysterious baby daughter, Samuel Whitmore had no idea that his act of compassion had just set in motion events that would lead him face to face with the most dangerous outlaw in the Montana Territory, a man who had been hunting Sarah Morrison across 3 states and whose connection to Samuel's own forgotten past would reveal a truth more devastating than any bullet could ever be. Sarah spent the morning recovering her strength while Samuel went about his daily chores, checking on his small herd of cattle and repairing the damage the storm had done to his property. The baby, Emma, seemed remarkably content despite the ordeal she had endured, rarely crying and watching everything around her with those strange amber eyes that seemed to take in far more than any infant should be able to comprehend. When Samuel returned to the cabin for the midday meal, he found Sarah standing at the window, looking out across the valley with an expression of intense concentration, as if she were searching for something specific among the rolling hills and scattered stands of pine trees. She turned when she heard him enter, and he noticed that she had changed from her muddy, torn dress into one of his spare shirts and a pair of trousers that she had somehow managed to alter to fit her smaller frame. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the borrowed clothes. "My dress was beyond saving, and I needed something clean to wear." "Of course not," Samuel replied, though he found himself oddly affected by the sight of her in his clothing. There was something intimate about it, as if by wearing his shirt, she had somehow become part of his life in a way that made him both pleased and uncomfortable. "Are you feeling better?" "Much thanks to your kindness," Sarah said, but her eyes kept drifting back to the window. "Tell me, do you ever get visitors out here? Travelers passing through?" "Perhaps." Samuel set down the bucket of milk he had been carrying and studied her face. The question seemed casual enough, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in her voice that suggested it was anything but idle curiosity. "Not often," he said carefully. "This isn't exactly on the main route to anywhere. Mostly just the occasional hunter or trapper, maybe someone who's gotten lost." "Why do you ask?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking her daughter's dark hair as the baby slept in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I told you my husband went for help when our wagon broke down, but that wasn't entirely true. The truth is, someone has been following us for weeks, maybe months. We've been running, trying to get somewhere safe, but he always seems to find us." "Who's been following you?" Samuel asked, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Living alone on the frontier had taught him to be prepared for trouble, even when it came in the form of a young mother and her baby. "A man named Marcus Thorne," Sarah said, and Samuel noticed that she shuddered slightly when she spoke the name. "He's dangerous. More dangerous than anyone you've probably ever encountered. He's killed people, Samuel, good people who just happened to get in his way. And he won't stop until he finds me and Emma. The name Marcus Thorne struck Samuel like a physical blow, though he couldn't immediately understand why. Something about it seemed familiar, as if he had heard it before in some half-remembered dream or distant conversation. He searched his memory but could find no clear recollection of ever encountering anyone by that name. Yet the feeling of recognition persisted, nagging at the edges of his consciousness like a word on the tip of his tongue. "What does he want with you?" Samuel asked, settling into his chair across from Sarah, his eyes never leaving her face as he tried to read the truth in her expression. Sarah's grip tightened on her daughter, and for a moment Samuel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one was carefully chosen. "Emma isn't just my daughter," she said. "She's his daughter too. Marcus Thorne is her father, and he wants her back." The revelation hit Samuel like a thunderbolt, and suddenly many things about Sarah's behavior began to make sense. The way she constantly watched the windows, the fear that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fire, the desperate exhaustion that had driven her to collapse in his yard during the storm. She wasn't just a traveler in distress. She was a woman fleeing from the father of her own child. "He's not a good man, Samuel," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "When I first met him, he seemed charming, even romantic. He told me he was a businessman, traveling through Colorado where I was working as a schoolteacher. But after Emma was born, I learned the truth about what he really did for a living. The murders, the robberies, the terror he spread wherever he went. I couldn't let my daughter grow up in that world, so I took her and ran." Samuel stood up and began pacing the small confines of his cabin, his mind racing as he tried to process this information. He had heard stories of Marcus Thorne, though he had never connected the name to the vague sense of familiarity it evoked. The man was legendary among outlaws, known throughout the Western Territories for his ruthlessness and his ability to disappear like smoke when the law got too close. If Sarah was telling the truth, then harboring her and her daughter was potentially the most dangerous thing Samuel had ever done. "How do you know he's still following you?" Samuel asked, stopping his pacing to look directly at Sarah. "Maybe you lost him somewhere along the trail." Sarah shook her head sadly. "Marcus isn't the kind of man who gives up. He has resources, connections in towns throughout the territory. People are afraid of him, so they tell him what he wants to know. And besides," she paused, reaching into her pocket to pull out a small piece of paper. "I found this tucked under the wheel of our wagon the morning before it broke down." Samuel took the paper and unfolded it carefully. Written in bold, dark letters were just 4 words. "I'm getting closer, Sarah." Below the message was drawn a simple symbol, a circle with a line through it like a target with a crosshair. The symbol hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow, and suddenly the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He had seen that mark before, carved into trees, scratched into rocks, drawn in the dust of countless trails. It was a signature, a calling card, and it belonged to someone he had spent years trying to forget. The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity, and with it came the realization that his peaceful life was about to be shattered forever. 23 years ago, Samuel Whitmore had been someone else entirely. He had been Samuel Thorne, younger brother of Marcus Thorne, partner in a string of bank robberies and train holdups that had made them both rich and infamous throughout the Colorado Territory. They had been inseparable then, bound by blood and by their shared contempt for the law and the civilized society that had rejected them both after their parents died in a cholera outbreak that swept through their hometown. But Samuel had grown tired of the violence, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of the fear he saw in the eyes of innocent people when they realized who he was. After a botched robbery in Denver had resulted in the death of a young bank clerk who had been trying to protect his pregnant wife, Samuel had made the decision to leave that life behind. He had taken his share of their ill-gotten gains and disappeared, changing his name and moving north to Montana Territory where he had bought land and built the quiet life he had always secretly dreamed of. He had never told Marcus of his plans, had simply vanished one night while his brother slept, leaving behind only a note explaining that he could no longer live the way they had been living. He had hoped that Marcus would understand, perhaps even follow his example and find a legitimate way to make a living. Instead, Marcus had become even more violent, more unpredictable, as if Samuel's abandonment had unleashed something dark and terrible that had been held in check by their brotherhood. Now, staring at the symbol that had been their secret sign, their way of communicating when they needed to meet or when one of them was in danger, Samuel realized that his past had finally caught up with him. But it hadn't come in the form of wanted posters or bounty hunters, as he had always feared. Instead, it had arrived in the form of a desperate woman and her innocent child, refugees from the very life he had once shared with his brother. "Samuel, are you all right?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Samuel carefully folded the paper and handed it back to her, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. Should he tell her the truth about who he really was? Should he admit that the man she was fleeing from was his own brother, the brother he had abandoned all those years ago? Or should he keep his secret and simply help her escape, hoping that Marcus would never realize how close he had come to his long-lost sibling? "I'm fine," he lied, moving back to the window to scan the horizon for any sign of approaching riders. "Just thinking about what we should do next. If this Marcus Thorne is as dangerous as you say, then we need to get you and Emma somewhere safe as quickly as possible." Sarah joined him at the window, shifting Emma to her other arm as the baby began to stir. "There is nowhere safe," she said quietly. "I've been running for months, and he always finds me. Towns, farms, cities, it doesn't matter. He has eyes everywhere, and people are too frightened of him to refuse to help when he comes asking questions." "Then we'll have to make a stand here," Samuel said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. The decision seemed to make itself, rising from some deep part of him that he thought he had buried forever. "This is good defensive ground, plenty of cover, and I know every inch of the surrounding territory. If he wants to take you and Emma, he'll have to go through me first." Sarah turned to look at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise. "Samuel, you don't understand what you're saying. This isn't your fight. You don't owe us anything more than you've already given us. Take us to town, point us toward the next territory, and forget you ever saw us. Don't throw your life away for strangers." But Samuel was already moving, checking his rifle and counting his ammunition, his mind shifting into the tactical patterns he hadn't used in over 2 decades. "You're not strangers anymore," he said simply. "You're under my protection now, and that means something out here." What he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to admit even to himself, was that this felt like a chance for redemption, an opportunity to atone for the sins of his youth by protecting an innocent woman and child from the monster his own brother had become. If Marcus wanted to reclaim his daughter, he would have to face the brother he thought he had lost forever, and Samuel would finally be able to settle the debt he owed to all the victims of their shared criminal past. The afternoon passed quietly, with no sign of approaching riders on any of the trails that led to Samuel's homestead. Sarah helped him prepare for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation, checking and cleaning weapons, moving supplies to strategic locations throughout the cabin, and discussing possible escape routes if their defenses were overwhelmed. Despite the gravity of their situation, Samuel found himself impressed by Sarah's competence and courage. She handled firearms with the confidence of someone who had learned to shoot out of necessity rather than sport, and her suggestions for improving their defensive position showed a tactical awareness that spoke of hard-earned experience. As evening approached, Emma became fussier, and Sarah was forced to admit that her milk had dried up during their ordeal in the storm. Samuel produced a can of condensed milk from his stores and showed Sarah how to mix it with water to create a suitable substitute, though both of them worried about how the baby would tolerate the change. Emma seemed to accept the new food readily enough, and soon settled into a peaceful sleep in a makeshift crib Samuel had constructed from a wooden crate and some of his spare blankets. "She's beautiful," Samuel said, watching the sleeping child with an expression of wonder. "Hard to believe someone so innocent could be at the center of all this violence." "Children often are," Sarah replied, settling into the chair beside the improvised crib. "They don't choose the circumstances they're born into, but they still have to live with the consequences of their parents' decisions." There was something in her voice, a note of regret or guilt, that made Samuel look at her more closely. "What aren't you telling me about Marcus?" he asked. "There's more to this story than just a father trying to claim his daughter." Sarah was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Marcus didn't just want Emma back because she's his daughter," she said. "He wants her back because of what she represents. You see, Marcus Thorne isn't just an outlaw. He's the leader of one of the largest criminal organizations in the Western Territories, and he's getting older. He's been looking for an heir, someone to carry on his legacy, and Emma is the only child he has." The implications of this revelation struck Samuel like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just pursuing them out of paternal instinct or wounded pride. He was chasing what he saw as the future of his criminal empire. In his twisted mind, little Emma was being groomed from birth to someday take over the network of thieves, killers, and corrupt officials that had made the Thorne name feared throughout the frontier. "He told me once that he planned to raise her to be everything he never was," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Smarter, more ruthless, more efficient. He talked about teaching her to read people, to manipulate them, to kill them if necessary. He wanted to create the perfect outlaw, and he saw our daughter as raw material to be shaped according to his vision." Samuel felt sick as he imagined his innocent niece being molded into a weapon by the brother he had once loved and trusted. The Marcus he had known 23 years ago had been capable of violence, but there had still been lines he wouldn't cross, principles he had held sacred. The man Sarah was describing seemed to have abandoned any pretense of humanity in favor of pure, calculated evil. "That's why I had to run," Sarah said, reaching out to touch Emma's tiny hand where it rested on the edge of the blanket. "I couldn't let him turn her into a monster. I couldn't let him steal her childhood and replace it with lessons in cruelty and betrayal. Even if it meant living in constant fear, even if it meant she might never have a real home, I had to try to give her a chance at a different kind of life." Samuel stood up and moved to the window again, staring out into the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus was coming, following their trail with the patience and persistence of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Samuel knew his brother well enough to know that he wouldn't give up, wouldn't be discouraged by weather or distance or the danger of riding alone through hostile territory. Marcus would keep coming until he found them, and when he did, there would be a reckoning that had been building for more than 2 decades. "Sarah," Samuel said without turning from the window, "I need to tell you something about myself, something that might change how you feel about accepting my help." "What is it?" she asked, and he could hear the concern in her voice. Samuel took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke the words, there would be no taking them back. "My real name isn't Samuel Whitmore," he said. "It's Samuel Thorne. Marcus Thorne is my brother." The silence that followed his confession seemed to stretch on forever. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the soft whisper of Sarah's breathing, could hear the tiny sounds Emma made in her sleep. Finally, he turned around to face Sarah, expecting to see accusation or fear or anger in her eyes. Instead, he saw something much worse, understanding. "I wondered," she said quietly. "When you saw that symbol on the paper, your reaction was too strong for someone who was just hearing about Marcus for the first time. And your eyes, they're the same color as his, the same shape. Emma has those eyes too." Samuel sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. "I left that life behind a long time ago," he said. "I changed my name, came here, built something decent and honest. I thought I had escaped the sins of my youth. But it seems the past has a way of finding you no matter how far you run." "Are you going to turn us over to him?" Sarah asked, and Samuel was surprised to hear no fear in her voice, only a kind of resigned acceptance, as if she had always known that this moment would come. "Never," Samuel said fiercely. "Whatever I was, whatever Marcus and I did together, that man died 23 years ago. The man I am now would die before he'd let harm come to you or Emma. You have my word on that." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "But Samuel, you need to understand what we're up against. Marcus isn't just dangerous because he's violent or ruthless. He's dangerous because he's smart, because he knows how to use people's weaknesses against them. And he knows you better than anyone else in the world. He'll know exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to get under your skin. Maybe, Samuel admitted, but he doesn't know the man I've become. He's still thinking of the scared, angry young man who followed him into a life of crime because he didn't know any other way to survive. That person doesn't exist anymore. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the night air, carried on the wind that had begun to blow down from the mountains. Samuel was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. Sarah quickly extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the dim glow from the fireplace. "How many?" Sarah whispered, moving to check her own weapon. Samuel strained his eyes, trying to count the dark shapes moving across the moonlit landscape. 3, maybe 4 riders, he said. They're coming up the main trail, not trying to hide their approach. That's Marcus, Sarah said with certainty. He never skulks or hides when he's closing in for a kill. He likes his victims to know he's coming, likes the fear it creates. Samuel watched the riders approach, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 23 years, he was about to come face to face with the brother he had abandoned. The brother who had probably spent all those years wondering why Samuel had left him, whether he was still alive, whether he would ever see him again. The reunion would not be a happy one. The riders stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of the circle of light cast by the windows. Samuel could see them clearly now, for men on horseback, their faces hidden in the shadows beneath their hat brims. One of them, the one riding slightly ahead of the others, sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command. Even after all these years, Samuel would have recognized that posture anywhere. "Marcus?" he whispered, and the name felt strange on his lips after so many years of silence. The lead rider urged his horse forward a few steps, close enough now that his voice would carry clearly to the cabin. When he spoke, his words cut through the night air like a blade. "Samuel Morrison," Marcus called out, using the false name Sarah had given. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me. Send out Sarah and my daughter, and you can live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and I'll burn that cabin down around your ears." Samuel felt a cold smile cross his lips. Marcus was using the wrong name, which meant he didn't yet realize who he was really dealing with. That gave Samuel a small advantage, though he doubted it would last long once the shooting started. "The woman and child are under my protection," Samuel called back, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground. "They stay with me." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "Your protection? What can one farmer do against 4 armed men? Be reasonable, Samuel. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." "You're right," Samuel replied, stepping closer to the window so his voice would carry more clearly. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You could just ride away, forget you ever found them, and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." "That's not going to happen," Marcus said, and Samuel could hear the anger beginning to creep into his voice. "That woman stole something precious from me, something I've spent months tracking across 3 territories. I don't give up on things that are mine." Samuel took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything, would shatter the careful anonymity he had maintained for more than 2 decades. But he also knew that the time for hiding was over, that the confrontation he had been avoiding for 23 years was finally at hand. "She didn't steal anything, Marcus," Samuel called out, stepping into the open doorway where he could be clearly seen. "She rescued her daughter from a life of violence and crime. Something I should have done for you a long time ago." The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel could see Marcus straightening in his saddle, could almost feel the shock radiating from the man who had been his brother, his partner, his closest friend for the first 25 years of his life. "Samuel?" Marcus's voice had changed, become uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Samuel, is that really you?" "Hello, Marcus," Samuel replied. "It's been a long time."